Afternoon, everyone. My name is Kroupin, and I'm going to be presenting some work I've been doing with my advisor, Susan Carey, on relational induction and relational matching tasks. So, in this symposium, we've been talking about the sort of developmental foundations of analogical reasoning. And analogical reasoning as a capacity is undergirded by a number of sort of foundational cognitive capacities. And what I want to do in this presentation is sort of explore what these foundational cognitive capacities are and propose a new foundation, well, a different foundational cognitive capacity, and specifically do all of this through the lens of relational match to sample, which Berkshire just did an excellent job of introducing as a task. So, what do we need to be able to succeed on relational match to sample? Well, as we've discussed at length in this symposium so far, we of course need relational representations, right? We need to be able to represent these images as same or different in order to succeed on this task. Of course, the other sort of foundation of analogical reasoning that's been discussed in the literature is executive functioning, right? So representing the same is not enough in and of itself. You need to represent one relation same, represent second relation same, hold those in working memory, compare those, and that takes some executive function capacities. Now, what I want to argue today is for a third foundation of analogical reasoning, which is qualitatively distinct from those previously, the two I've just discussed, but no less critical to success on analogical reasoning in general and relational match sample in particular. And I want to argue that this foundational capacity impacts everything from the way that we design our stimuli when we're doing analogical reasoning research, all the way to the way that we discuss the human unique components of analogical reasoning. So what is this capacity that I'm talking about? Well, let's go back to the task. So in relational match sample, participants are asked which one of these two bottom cards goes with the top card. And to us, when we look at this task, the answer jumps out as the relation same. Same is the basis of matching we're using in this task. But what I want to point out is that while that's a perfectly fine answer to the question which of these cards goes with the top card, so is this answer we got from a 4-year-old, because they're both pointy. In fact, that was a justification for a trial the kid got wrong. And I don't know what the criterion of pointiness is, but it doesn't really matter. For any criterion of pointiness that this kid is using, it's a logically sort of fine answer to use that as a basis of matching this task. As is an even more interesting basis of matching we got from a 4-year-old that, and this is a shortening and a paraphrase, that basically these two cards match because they both look like things in a playground near the place my mother does her exercises. So my point here is that we can represent both same and these other justifications. And all of them are bases of matching we could use in this task, right? There's nothing about this task inherently that makes it have to be same. And in fact, these examples that I'm using are just sort of more or less arbitrary. We could come up with an indefinite number of possible ways of matching on this task. And my point is, the fact that we look at these stimuli and just like that generate the relation same is impressive. That's really cool, right? So that's actually a major achievement from this infinity of possible ways of matching. We just automatically, in the blink of an eye, calculate, oh yeah, it's going to be the matching on same. And because there are an innumerate number of other possibilities, if you don't have that same instinct that we do to generate same as the basis of matching, you could be lost in that field of possibilities for a very long time, even if you could represent the relation same. Okay, so this capacity, this ability to find within this field of possibilities the relational representation that's necessary to succeed on the task at hand, I want to refer to that capacity as relational induction, right? So relational induction, I want to describe as the necessary process of identifying the task-relevant relational representation among possible alternatives, right? So we can, of course, these possible alternatives are limited to the things we can represent, but not determined by them. Okay, so that's all well and good. A priori arguments always can be interesting, but why should we care about relational induction in sort of our empirical studies of the development of analogical reasoning? Well, the claim I want to make is that an account of the ontogenetic or phylogenetic emergence of analogical reasoning, which includes relational induction, in addition to relational representation and executive function, can account for phenomenon that theories that don't include relational inductions cannot account for. And I'm going to try and support this claim with two unique predictions. So the first of these comes out of existing body of work. So previous literature has shown extensively that young children and non-human animals persistently fail relational match to sample. This is particularly striking in non-human animals who will persist in failing relational match to sample even after tens of thousands of trials of training on relational match to sample, on a relational match to sample task. Into this literature, as foreshadowed in the previous talk, comes Smirnova et al., who with crows and parrots showed spontaneous success on relational matching in non-human animals, right? Massive contrast to previous literature. Right, so how did they do this? They gave these birds a series of non-relational match to sample training tasks. So they got crows to two criterion matching black to black and not to white, that shape to that shape and not to that shape, series of non-relational tasks, then tested on a series of relational match to sample tasks, at which point the bird succeeded spontaneously. Existing theories can account for this in only one of two ways, right? Either these match to sample training tasks change the crows and parrots' relational representations qualitatively, or they change their executive functions in some way. In both cases, I would argue that that seems unlikely, given that none of these training tasks contained relational representations, relations at all. It's unlikely that they improved relational representations. Likewise, there's no obvious way in which they improved executive function. So can an account which includes relational induction do a better job of accounting for this phenomenon, this success? Well, what would that imply? That would imply that at least some of these training tasks, what they're doing isn't changing representations, isn't changing executive function. What they're doing is changing relational induction. What these training tasks, at least some of them, are doing is making it more likely that these birds who already can represent, on this account, already can represent same and difference and have the executive function to complete the task, what they're doing is making it more likely that they actually use those representations in a relational matching context. So that leads us to our first prediction, which is basically what I just spelled out. At least some of these tasks should increase relational matching in a population that already can make relational matches. How can we, so what population do we know can make relational matches? Well, we can. In fact, we're so good at it, it's a little bit problematic for this study because adults are at ceiling at relational match to sample. Hopefully this isn't surprising to anybody. So what we need is a task in which relational matches are available for adults, but not all adults choose these relational matches, right? So this is the position that we hypothesize the crows, the birds and potentially young kids to be in, that they can make these relational matches, but choose to match on a different basis of matching. So how do we do this? Well, we generated a task that we refer to as object match to sample versus relational match to sample. The structure is the same as normal relational match to sample, but now it's sort of ambiguous. We've got a match on the relation same versus a partial object match, right? So we gave this task to adults on MTurk, 8 trials, no feedback, just see what happens. Let me orient you to this graph. So on the y-axis here, we have the proportion of adults that fall into one of 3 matcher types. So object matchers are those who matched 7 or 8 out of 8 trials on that partial object match. Relational matchers match 7 or 8 out of 8 on the relational match, and mixed matchers anybody in between. The reason I'm displaying these data like this is because we are interested specifically in that group of object matchers. Those are the people that are in the position we are hypothesizing the non-human animals and young children to be in. They can match on relations, but don't infer relations to be relevant. And so when we give adults 8 trials with no training, we get almost an even split. Okay, so now what we do is take 2 tasks, 2 of the matched sample tasks from Smirnov et al., and train adults with them. In fact, this is part of a much larger series of studies. I'm happy to talk about more studies we've done in this series, but I'm just focusing on the critical results for the hypothesis here. Okay, so we trained them on either number or size match the sample. So number match the sample is one shape goes with one shape and not 3 shapes, and vice versa. Size is big shapes goes with big shapes and not small shapes. Okay, so what we do is give them 8 trials of training on either number or size match the sample. And if they get it wrong, they get corrected. And then they get 8 trials of that same ambiguous task that I introduced just now. Right? So what happens? Again, the hypothesis here is that if what these match the sample tasks are doing is making it more likely that a population which already has the representational and executive capacities to make relational matches, these match sample tasks should make even that population more likely to make relational matches. And lo and behold, that's what happens. Right? So we have a significant increase in relational matches, significant decrease in object matchers after training on these 2 tasks. Okay, cool. So we have adult support for this prediction from adults, but who knows, maybe adults are just really good at things. Maybe what's going on with adults is just qualitatively different. So our account would also predict that these same match sample training tasks should work with kids. And specifically, kids at an age where they don't spontaneously succeed on relational match to sample. And it should work, of course, if they have the capacity to make these relational matches. Okay, so basically what we did is replicate the adult study with kids, with 4-year-olds. So in our population, as Rocher discussed, at least in our Cambridge population, 4-year-olds tend to fail relational match to sample. So what we did was, replicate the adult study. We either just gave them 8 trials of relational match to sample in the control condition, or trained them on number match to sample or size match to sample, exactly the same stimuli with adults, just instead of on the computer, we did it with cards. So this is just the proportion, percentage correct matches as a group. With no training, 4-year-olds in our sample, as usual, are not above chance. And with number and size training, just like adults, we see a significant increase in relational matching. We see a significant increase in relational matching. Okay, so moving quickly, so that supports our first sort of unique prediction. A second unique prediction, just sort of try to speed through here, is because relational induction, unlike the capacity to represent relations or executive function, relational induction is the process of selecting a particular representation out of a set of possibilities, right? So a prediction that comes out of a relational induction account is that changing the set of options under consideration should be able to influence whether relations are selected, whether relations are identified as relevant to the task at hand. So let me show you what I mean by that in this context. So in this ambiguous task that we designed, the options, at least the obvious options, are match on the relation same versus an object match. And the object match here is the object is the same on shape, color, and size. And we know that adults are really, if we just show them that kind of matches on shape, color, and size, at ceiling, no problem, everybody's great. In contrast, adults are actually really bad at size match to sample. They're really low rates of spontaneously identifying size as the correct basis of matching, right? So 40% of adults, when given 8 trials of size match to sample with correction, never figure it out. Okay, so what we do is the idea here is we're going to change the alternatives at play while keeping the relational content of the task identical. And this is what we came up with. So Again, we have a match on the relation same versus a size match. Of course, it's also a color and a shape match, but then that's not unique in the context of this task. So the relational content of these tasks are identical, and yet a relational induction account would predict that there's going to be a difference in the proportion of relational matches. All right. Between these two, keeping everybody awake. Okay, so this is data you've already seen before. That's the control condition. And this is what happens when we just change the context, change the set of alternatives. We get a significant effect. And that one lonely object matcher at the top there. Okay, so that supports our second unique prediction. And so briefly, I want to conclude by saying that I think that both a priori considerations and empirical data support the fact that we need to include this sort of concept of relational induction in our theories of analogical reasoning. And there's a series of sort of consequences and questions that follow from this. I'll run through these briefly, starting with something as basic as stimuli design. As I've shown in the previous study, and as Rakshu has gestured in a previous talk, the alternatives available within the stimuli, the dimensions on which the stimuli vary, are going to influence how likely it is for any particular individual to focus on the relations in that context. And I think it's especially important to think about what a given population, say kids or non-human animals, what are they likely to focus on? Not over and above what they're able to focus on. And in fact, I think it's particularly cool to think about, all right, what are we focusing on? Why is it that we, when we see relational match sample, go same or different? What process is happening within us, and how might that process differ in other populations? In terms of the development of analogical reasoning, we have this clear shift, specifically in relational induction around the ages of 3 and 4. At least some 3 and 4-year-olds can match on relations, and yet don't. By the time they're adults, at least on our Western sample, all of them do. So what kind of development is that? And how is the change we can make in an experimental context in relational induction related to the change over developments in ontogeny or phylogeny in relational induction in the same context? And finally, I think the focusing on relational induction is important for considerations of the human uniqueness, the human unique aspects of analogical reasoning. Of course, there are certain representational formats that only humans can generate. But I think it's an interesting question to consider, an interesting and important question to consider. What are there also human unique aspects to what we tend to use those representations for? Even if we share a representational format of same and different with other animals or young children, do we use it in the same context? And with that, I'd like to thank my advisors, Student Carey and the Carey Lab, Jean-Marie for organizing this symposium, and of course, CEU for hosting.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the task effect. So in both the bird training literature and in your experiments, the training itself is always a match to sample task in itself, right? So have you done anything where you train your participants on something that induces relational representations in your sense, but is not a match to sample task? Or alternatively, which is potentially even stronger, use a match to sample task to destroy their sort of propensity to represent the relation rather than the object?
That's a very good question. So there's a couple of things. We haven't done anything that's not a match to sample task, because what I'm always afraid of, is, especially in this kind of context, is, especially with kids, is the degree to which they think the two tasks will be related. So part of the reason I think it's kind of effective, both I think also with non-human animals and young children, to use matched sample tasks which even look kind of similar, and the similar context is that that increases the likelihood that they'll carry anything over to a new task, because that's never a given. Though I think in principle there should be, if we can figure out a way to make sure that they carry this over, there should be something that would work like that. In terms of making them less likely to match on relations. I think, again, we haven't done anything that would do that. But I agree that that should be possible. It should basically, basically from the work that we've done, I would suspect you'd have to make a task where relational matches were available, but they were the wrong choice. And then you give them relational matching tasks, and they'll avoid them. That would be mine.
Okay, it's mine. So here am I in the middle. Hi.
Sorry. Yeah.
Up there. Up here. Okay. So I'm not sure whether it's a well-formed question, but so you and all the other speakers talk about relations between stimuli. You talk about stimuli design, right? But I'm not quite sure that stimuli is a natural concept that animals and children, even adults, have these kinds of concepts. So, but there is a specific kind of thing, right, which invites relational reasoning, and these are symbols. So I just wonder whether it would help to change the talk from stimuli to symbols, and so whether the big changes that you see over age, ontogeny, or even maybe it's a question for everyone. In the stimuli, if you did between something is produced by a person who could generate symbols, right? Or expected to generate symbols, and so whether your idea of relational induction depends on whether they see these things as things in themselves or whether they see them as symbols.
Yeah, so I do think that's a question sort of partially for everybody. But in my context, I think it will necessarily have an effect whether they see it as symbols. I don't know. It's kind of has to be a case-by-case basis answer to whether it will promote success on a given task. So, for example, if you as with the Jean-Remy's relation match to sample stimuli, which are these complex winding shapes, if they're complex enough, they might just draw so much attention to the shapes themselves or the symbols themselves that you might not attend to the relationship between them. If the context is such that you expect these symbols to be related in some way, possibly. But I guess I would have to say that it would have to be I think there will always be a difference whether they're symbols or not, and whether the individual recognizes them as symbols. But it's sort of hard to give a universal answer about what effect that would have. It kind of really depends on what the context would be like.
Hi, hello, here. So, is there anything in the results so far that would allow you to say what is rather doing the job during the training? Is it the fact that people are getting positive feedback on solving the task along relation, like size, or what was the other one, size or
number?
Number, yeah. Or is it the fact that none of the training task involves object matching, or same token matching? Or is this something you're interested in figuring out or not?
Excellent question. So yes, so I would argue that neither number matching nor size matching involves relational matching per se. So that you're not matching. You can think of size as a relational feature, but you're not matching. So it's a very different kind of relational matching than matching same to same. Big to small is sort of a different sense of relational matching. But I think your second point is absolutely on the ball. Two things. I think that, especially for size, I think what size does is because it's very unlikely to be considered as an object match. Nobody matches on size. Kids don't, adults don't. And so if they come into the task looking for matches, maybe on color or like whatever, pointiness, being made to match on size sort of disabuses them of the idea that there's anything in a particular single object that they would expect to match on, that they should be matching on. I think that makes them less likely to focus on the features of individual objects in a subsequent task. Number, I think, plays a sort of twofold role. Also, it doesn't contain object matches, but it also sort of focuses them on set properties. So matching on the properties of a whole collection of items as opposed to an individual item. And we have some evidence to suggest that both those mechanisms, that's exactly what's going on here, but it's an ongoing project.
Hi, at the back.
Yeah.
Just to follow on with that question, really, and the line of questioning, my understanding with the non-human primates would be that they are given more token-based training for match-to-sample training. So match a circle to a circle, triangle to a triangle kind of training. And so perhaps that is, you know, in the light of your talk, particularly disadvantaging them when it comes to the relational match-to-sample task. I'm not sure if that is that the case, would be the first part of the question. And then secondly, if you gave children or adults that kind of experience, would you predict them to get worse at the relational match?
Excellent question. So I think that, yes, so I've tried to look into whether that's the case with non-human animals, and at least sometimes it is. One of the problems is that, and this is one of the things that I really think is important if we start to take seriously the issue of relational induction, is that a lot of non-human animal studies don't report what previous training was done. And I've sometimes even found papers like, I just happened to find a paper 2 years earlier, gorillas with the same name have done match the sample before being tested on relational match sample, right? But it's hard to identify that. At least sometimes it happens. And I do think I would predict that that would make it harder to teach them teach them relational match sample. With kids, we've run this, so I'll show you. Identity match the sample. We've used this as training for both kids and adults before the relational match sample and the ambiguous task respectively. For kids, it doesn't shift them anywhere, doesn't get them above chance. So you can't really make them worse. I mean, though we could try running 5-year-olds on this. Maybe that we haven't tried that yet. With adults, it doesn't make them match more on objects, but I'm pretty sure that's because those people who were going to match on relations, we're going to match on relations on the subsequent task, will match on relations anyway. It's not that this task rules against their assumption about matching on relations. What the hell? Excuse me. I should probably stop talking. That's probably what the cue is. So yeah, we've tried. I completely agree with your intuition about non-human animals. And probably with kids, I would think that maybe if we ran 5-year-olds with this, they would get worse.
So thank you very much.